So I want to talk about our purpose in this course. If you go to the UA catalog, it states that this course, quote, surveys Alaska Native peoples, including cultural heritage, ethnohistory, it means like culture history, and contemporary experiences from an anthropological perspective. What the heck is an anthropological perspective? We'll talk about that in a minute. I want to focus on the contemporary experiences part of that equation, though. When we talk about Alaska Native cultures, we're not just talking about something historic, we're talking about vibrant, living cultures today. So I like this catalog description. Another way of thinking about what we're doing in this class is that we're kind of pushing back on 3 common misconceptions about Alaska Native cultures that you might have heard before. The first one is that Alaska Native cultures or people are gone, or that the cultures are dying out. Another misconception that you might hear is that Alaska Native is a single culture, and people don't always directly say that, but when people say things like, oh, Alaska Native culture believes blah blah blah, they're making sort of a homogenization about all Alaska Native groups. And then misconception number 3 is the idea that colonialism in Alaska happened a long time ago, right? When people say things like, oh, it's so sad what happened, past tense. So I want to kind of work against those 3 misconceptions. First, the idea that Alaska Native cultures are gone. So part of the point of this course is to show that that's not the case at all. The most recent census tells us that about 15% of the state of Alaska identifies as Alaska Native alone. Now, the way that census data work, well, for one thing, they often undercount indigenous communities. Number 2, another thing is that people can identify as more than one racial group. And so for both of those reasons, this 15% is definitely an undercount. So I think it would be reasonable, very, very reasonable, to say 20% of Alaska, at least, is Alaska Native. So 1 in 5 of the people in our state are Alaska Native. Some of the people listening to this lecture are Alaska Native. And so to say that Alaska Native communities are gone is simply factually wrong. But I think part of what people are saying when they make these kinds of statements is that the cultures maybe are dying out, the traditions. The reality, though, so we're going to talk about kind of a bit of a duality here. On the one hand, Alaska Native cultures have been subject to incredible pressures from the beginning of colonialism that have dramatically transformed communities. That is without a doubt true. At the same time, we'll see various ways in which cultural traditions are ongoing, sometimes have partially died out and then become revitalized. People are starting to pick back up traditions in the ways that even in communities that have had huge transformations in language, in religion, and technology, the way in which cultural values continue to inform the way that people think about life. For example, later in this course, we'll do a reading about a community called Angoon, a Tlingit village, and the way in which people still talk all the time about a historic tragedy that happened when there was a naval bombardment of the village, and the way that people continue to think about that event through the lens of Tlingit values, cultural values. So even though the community has changed a lot in the last 300 years, cultural values continue to be an important part of how people think about their lives and think about their histories. And so we'll talk about this idea of cultural persistence and cultural revitalization. It still matters and is important to understand these cultural traditions that are ongoing and continue to be an important part of who we are as Alaskans and who Alaska Native communities are in their own communities. With that in mind, I hope you enjoy the reading that we did from Knights Indian Tribe. Knights Indian Tribe, the sovereign nation of the Knights, is a tribal entity located here on the peninsula. Their headquarters are in Kenai, the next town over from Soldotna, where our campus is. And I hope that in that reading, traditions carried on, where it was talking about that potlatch, you realize that people are talking about traditions that have been going on for centuries as far as potlatch traditions. Sharing traditions, ways that we honor, right? The ways that it honors when the first fish are being caught that year. And so traditions continue to be a part of people's lifeways, even if communities obviously look very different than 300 years ago. And I also want to focus on that too. People sometimes make a note of historic change and use that to downplay how much Native cultures are still present day and vibrant. But if you think about it, cultures in general change over time, right? A culture doesn't have to remain static to still be that culture. My ancestors crossed the Great Plains to get to Utah, and they had, covering wagons and all this stuff and bushy beards and brimmed hat. Obviously, that's not the way I dress. Obviously, that's not the way I get places. I don't travel in a covered wagon when I'm going to Fred Meyer. I travel in a car, in an SUV. And so my point with that is, right, cultures can change, but that doesn't mean a culture is gone. And I hope that that reading helped highlight that. I also hope you liked the reading that was from your book, and that I also had a scan of the Dena'ina, or Dena'ina, depending on where you are actually in Dena'ina territory. I tend to say it Dena'ina, partly because of where I'm located, but in areas like Anchorage, it would be as common or more common also to hear Dena'ina. But the reading Dena'ina, Heritage and Representation in Anchorage. And I really liked the kind of interspersing of Steve Langdon's narrative and then Aaron Fell's, and I liked what Aaron was saying about, for example, sort of what these like signs, right? This lack of information. If you walk around Anchorage, right, it would be very easy to forget that this is was originally native land and not originally sort of a community just, that magically appeared out of nowhere, but that these were native lands, and it would be easy to forget the people that were there. And even some of the historical markers are not particularly, well, historically accurate, as it talks about in the reading. So part of what we're trying to do in this course then is to talk about those histories and how they shape the present, and talk about that these cultures are ongoing, so that we don't sort of invisibilize them, right? And I think we're doing a better job of that now. This is just really a really little example, but sort of the Dena'ina Convention Center in Anchorage, I think, is a good sort of reminder for folks when they hear that name, they think about the indigenous peoples of this land. But that's an ongoing thing for people to remember and to keep in mind, the ongoing cultural diversity and indigenous cultural diversity of these lands. So another misconception that you sometimes hear about Native people in general and Alaska Native people in particular is that it's a single culture. And again, people don't usually say it just like that, but people will say things like, what does this mean in Alaska Native culture, right? What does this symbolism mean in Alaska Native culture? You'll see that on Facebook sometimes, sort of, what do totem poles mean in, quote, Alaska Native culture? One thing I want us to get right at the very start is that there is not a single, quote, Alaska Native culture, right? There are certainly values that I would say you find throughout many, perhaps all, Alaska Native communities, things such as respect for elders, things such as ideas about reciprocity with the land. However, that's different than saying that it is literally one culture. So for us as anthropologists, when we speak about a culture, because culture can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but when we use the term, we are meaning something rather specific. We're talking about the shared practices and ways of thinking and ways of communicating of a group of people, okay? So the fact that in the United States we drive on the right side of the road is an example of culture. The fact that in the United States a red octagon means stop is an example of culture, right? The fact that in the United States, most people, if you were to ask them, think that when a group makes a decision, they should take a vote. If it's a large group and if it's a political decision, that's an example of culture, right? These are sort of ingrained ways of doing things and ways of thinking. So when we talk about the cultures in Native Alaska, though, it really is cultures, plural. Many, dozens and dozens of different Native communities, historically and at present. 13 different regional corporations, and we'll talk about what that means later. 198 different village corporations, numerous villages that are not parts of the village corporations, over 200 recognized tribal entities. So in addition to these corporations, a number of tribal entities, such as Kenites Indian tribe. That's a lot of diversity. Another way of thinking of it is through languages. So oftentimes if a community has a different language than the next community over, we think of them as having a different culture. They might have related cultures. So for example, Dena'ina and ANTH, right, next door to each other, related languages, related cultures, a lot of similarities going on there, but still distinct cultures, distinct histories. And if we think of it that way, there are actually 20 different Alaska Native languages. And here they are: ANTH, Aliu, or Unangam Tuno, Lutik or Shukpiak, Dena'ina or Dena'ina, Deganag, Iak, Gwich'in, Haida, Han, Lukachek, Inupiaq, Koyukon, or you sometimes hear Denake, Tanana, Tanacross, Tlingit, Tsimshian, Upper Kuskokwim, Upper Tanana, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik. And even within Yupik, you have diversity, such as the different dialects of Yupik and Cupig. So that's a lot of diversity, right? And some of these languages are really closely related to each other, such as, again, ANTH and Danina, and, share some words or very similar words in common. And we might draw a comparison to European languages, such as like French and Italian, and the similarities you see there, especially, where France and Italy border each other. But some of these are entirely different language families, entirely different histories, as far as we can tell archaeologically, entirely different trajectories that diverged thousands and thousands of years ago. And so then we'd be talking about the differences between like European cultures and entirely maybe like Western European and Eastern European, or Eastern European and Central Eurasian, right? So like major differences all within this place called Alaska. Alaska is a very culturally diverse and culturally rich place. So it's not a single culture. These groups, despite having some shared values and ways of doing things, also have major differences, partly just based on different places that people live, right? So these are some Inupiat men who are dragging some muktuk, or what's going to be some bowhead whale blubber and skin near a barrow. And so some of these are just differences based on like where you live, right? So obviously this isn't something that you'd see in an interior at the Baskin village. But also there are differences in terms of ceremonial regalia, in terms of dancing, in terms of traditionally how society was established. We'll talk about some of that more next week. But I just want you to think about the fact that there really were a lot of differences between these different groups, and still are. The final misconception that I want to talk about is the idea that colonialism in Alaska happened a long time ago. Now, there's some truth to that, because yes, colonialism started a long time ago. But it didn't end a long time ago, because colonialism to some degree is ongoing. I'm not trying to suggest that colonialism is the exact same sort of animal that it was 300 years ago in terms of how it plays out or looks, right? Obviously, it's very different to have active military battles between Russian forces and native forces. That's very different than the situation we see today in Alaska. Obviously, I'm not trying to do a false equivalency there. However, the way I sometimes explain this to my students, it's a helpful reminder for me, is the fact that I don't have to pull out my passport as I drive around Alaska and go through different native territories to show that I'm a citizen of the United States is an example of the fact that colonialism is ongoing, right? Because Alaska and native communities do not have the sort of, how would I say this? The fact that it is all still considered a part of the United States, right, is evidence that we are living in sort of a present day that has a colonial aspect to it, right, where lands that were originally fully in control of one group of people have since been brought partially under the control of a larger political entity, right, which is ultimately what colonialism is. So there's a colonial past and what that looked like, but it also shapes the colonial present, right? And we'll talk more about what we mean by that, and we'll see the ways that that manifests, because there are some ways in which Alaska Native communities have a lot of control over their lands and their livelihood and their futures, and there are other ways in which there are pretty tight controls over certain kinds of things, and people continue to be strongly affected, sometimes in negative ways, because of those controls. So we'll talk about that more as we go throughout the course. Now, my goal in all of this is education, not indoctrination or proselytization. So why am I saying that? Well, it's an anthropology course, and it's a course about Alaska Native cultures. We're going to sometimes have political and social topics come up. It is simply unavoidable. You cannot talk about cultural issues without talking about the present day cultural issues, which oftentimes involve a political or social edge. For example, we will talk about how climate change impacts Inupiat communities. For example, we will talk about the rather controversial, on both sides, pebble mine, because these affect Alaska Native cultures. My goal here is not to change your emotions or your politics or your stances. That is your own business, and I am not in charge of that, and I am not here to change you. Whatever your views, that's great. You have your views. That's cool. That's not my business at all. That's not what we're doing here in a college class. My goal, though, is that whatever views you hold, that you operate in life with an informed understanding of Alaska Native cultures and histories. That as you go about the state of Alaska, that you understand the histories and also the present-day reality for tribal entities, for Native corporations. You understand things like INCSA. You understand things like how environmental issues affect Native corporations. That we have an informed understanding, whatever our views are, that it be based on data, that it be based on facts about Alaska Native communities today.